So now we're going to turn to Daf Tezayim and Beis. What was the Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Shmuel from Balmum to Onen? Uma Balmum sha'ochel. A Balmum is allowed to eat from Kodesh Kodshim, but nevertheless im Avad. Chilel Onen she'ein ochel. Onen is more chamur. He's not allowed to eat from the basar. Notice his exclusion is not only in doing the avoda, as we derive from one of the various derivations on Amud Aleph, but rather he's enjoined beyond that from eating the basar. An onen can't eat the basar of the karma. Is no din shem of achil. How much more so, since the Torah is more machmer in an onen than in a balmum. Therefore, the same din that a balmum is machalas avoda certainly should apply to an onen who's going to be machalas avoda. Gemara rejects this. Right? We said before there's a chumrah of karev kemakriv, meaning that the psul of mum applies even to the animal itself. And obviously that has no application to an onen. An onen doesn't passel the animal. An animal can't be an onen. Is zar yochiach. Now, when it says zar yochiach, this is after the entire sugya that proved that a zar is machalas avoda. Now, a zar is machalas avoda, even though he doesn't have that chumrah of karev kemakriv. That's a special chumrah in mum. Well, guess what? You can't derive anything from a zar because mal zar shekain ein lo takon. Right? We're trying to derive now that an onen is machal his avoda. An onen is an onen, but tomorrow he's no longer an onen. But a zar is a zar is a zar. He'll always be a zar. Balmum yochiach. Now again, in order to understand what the Gemara means by balmum yochiach, we have to know a lot more about mumin. But apparently there are two categories of mumin. Right? There are some mumin that could be healed with the passage of time, and there's some mum that can never be healed. But in any event, since mum has the possibility of healing in certain cases, so it's yesh lo takana. So what are we proving now from Balmum? That what? Right, you wanted to say that maybe the reason why Zar passels the avoda is because it's ein lo takana. I'll demonstrate to you that even if it's yesh lo takana, it would still be machal avoda, and that we're going to prove from the case of Balmum. Because I did, and we go back and forth over here, because we said that Balmum cannot be the source because it has the chumrah of karev kemakriv. We can't prove anything from a zar because a zar ein lo takana, whereas an onen yesh lo takana is lo roizeh kroizeh lo roizeh hatzad shovish behen shemus harim, that both the case of a balmum as well as the case of a zar are enjoined from doing the avoda, v'im avdu chillo, and they machal the avoda, which we derived on Amud Aleph with regard to a zar. Is afani avi onen. Now I can derive onen shemuzar. He likewise is enjoined from doing the avoda. Therefore, im avad chilel, we could derive the conclusion he could perform that if he performs the avoda, that the avoda is disqualified. Fact, the Gemara, you're assuming that an onen is enjoined from doing the avoda midolan. Heichad muzar. Give me a source for that. And again, the Gemara is going to go through the two sources with regard to the dialogue between Aaron and Moshe regarding the burning of the soil lechatos of Rosh Chodesh. Hechan Musar, ilema min hamikdash lo yetze. If we're going to assume that since the Torah commands the Kohen Gadol to continue with his avoda even though he's an onen, implying that a regular Kohen would be enjoined from doing the avoda if he was an onen. Is chil begufei ksivbe. On that, in that very pasuk, if that pasuk is going to be a valid source for proving that an onen is mechalas avoda, then why do we need this whole kal v'chomer? Ella, but rather we have to find a different source for enjoining the onen from doing the avoda. Ella mehein hikrivu. Because Sorim Mipnei Aninus Nisrafa. Right, we said before that the Gemara is going to have at the end of Zevachim Machlokas why they burnt the soyer of Rosh Chodesh at the time of the Akamas HaMishkan. Was it because the basar was contracted tumah, or was it because they were makrivit ba'onin? And now we're holding Mipnei Aninus Nisrafa, that the reason why it was burnt is because the Bnei Aaron were owning it. So again, just to summarize, so we know where we're holding here, because it's hard to hold cup here. We're deriving the prohibition of an onen from doing the avoda from a tzareshove of, get this right, of a balmum and a zar. I think I got it right. So the Gemara says, "Ikol mifrach malatzad shavash shein lo huchu mechlolo." That there is a case Eli, I'm giving a shir now. I'll get back to you. Amir Hashem. Thanks. So what's hucha mechlolo? Apparently, there are cases where a balmum and a zar are exempt. Hutar. Oh, so what's going to be the case? So if it's a balmum, no. Just the opposite. The chumrah of balmum and zar is that there's no heter whatsoever. But in the case of an onen, the Kohen Gadol is allowed to do the avodah b'aninus. So that's a kula in aninus. Is tamei yochiach. Now, this is based on a very gigantic sugya called Tuma Hutra B'Tzibur, that if the Kohen is tamei and it's a korban tzibur and the entire tzibur depends upon this avoda, then the Torah allowed a Kohen tamei to do the avoda of a korban tzibur. So therefore, we prove from tamei that his avoda is mechuleles, And just like in the case of Onen, you found a heter, namely the Kohen Gadol is allowed to do the avoda ba'aninus. So too, with regard to Tuma, we find that there's a heter, and Tuma hutra b'tzibur, and the Kohen Tomei could do the avoda of a korban tzibur. And therefore, Tomei could now be the source from which we derive Onen. But the only problem is we had a Chumra in Tomei because Tuma is contagious. Malu Tomei became a Tamei. Hanach Yochichu. So now we're introduced Balmum, or for example, Azar. In both cases, they don't have that Chumra of being Metame Acheret. They don't impact on others. And yet, if they did the avoda, it's avoda mechulel. It's v'chazra did. Is that tzad shavush became musharin, right? So we're going to derive it from a balmum and a zar, and apparently a tummy as well. And even though you'll say, well, a tummy transmits his tumah to others, well, a balmum or a zar does not. And it's lo roi zeh, karoi zeh. You know, what each one is missing, the other one's missing. So when it says v'lifroch ma tzad hashovish behem shekain lo hutru mechlolan etzel kohen gadol b'karban yochid. Right, so we said that in Onen, if he's a Kohen Gadol, he continues the avoda, and it doesn't matter whether it's a korban tzibur or a korban yochid. So the Torah was more mekel in Onen than in all the other cases, because we don't find that, you know, a Kohen Gadol who's tamei or he's a balmum or for that matter a zar could ever, you know, do the avoda. And Onen, at least the Kohen Gadol could do the avoda. So Gemara says, Shem mia tuma mias ishterei. I guess the Gemara is saying that just like Onen, in the case of a Kohen Gadol, has the permission to do the avoda, so too at some point, even a tamei, although it's only in the case of a korban tzibur, but he does have permission to do the avoda. Ramasharshia. Okay, another possibility of how do we know that an onen is machal his avoda? Asir v'kavachom Yosef. Good old Yosef. Ma Yosef she'ochel im avar chilel onen she'eno ochel eno din shim avar chilel. Mal Yosef sh'gei posel yedus. Mi Yosef talmid chacham. Right? We don't have to go through this again and again. Mal Shem Yosef sh'gei posel yedus. Right, so even though you have an exception to the rule in the case of a Talmud Chacham, but nevertheless the Shem Yoshev is a psul in Edus. And that's a chumrah in Yoshev, and therefore I can't derive from Yoshev who passes his avoda that therefore an onen would likewise passel his avoda. Shem Yoshev lo parach. You know, I'm not interested in the conceptual, abstract status of the category of a Yoshev. As long as I find one case where a Yoshev can do the Edus, then that pircha falls off. The Imtim Tzolom Parich, and if you're going to say that Rav Sharshi, in fact, does accept a pircha of Shem Yoshev, which is a psul in Edus, Asya mi Yoshev umichana mihanach. I could always add one of the others, like, for example, a Balmum or a Tomei or a Zar, and I could create a tzarashel. The Mishnah says that onen is possible. Omar Rav lo sharel b'korban yochid. Al b'korban tzibur meratza. According to Rava, if the onen went ahead and he did the korban tzibur, then it is valid. And this we derive, says Rava, the Gemara is going to slug this up, but kal v'chomer mituma. Ma tuma shelo hutra mechlola eitzel kohen gadol bekarbon yachid hutra eitzel hedjod bekarbon tzibur. So again, in the case of a kohen gadol who's an onen, I'm sorry, of a kohen gadol who's a tameh. So again, we want to prove that an onen with regard to a korban tzibur doesn't disqualify the korban. And this is going to derive from Tumah. Because keep in mind that we're going to have a heter in Tumah for the sake of a korban tzibur. Now, Aninus is mutter in the case of the Kohen Gadol, even for a korban yachid. So what's the Kal V'chomer? Ma Tumah shelo hutra mechlola eitzel Kohen Gadol b'korban yachid. So a Kohen Gadol who contracted Tumah is enjoined from doing the avoda even in any case. I shouldn't say even, but in any case. Even if it's a korban, certainly if it's a korban yachid. So Tumah is very chamor. But yet, Tumah has a heter in the case of a korban tzibur. That applies to any Kohen. Now, Aninus, on the other hand, has a kula that a Kohen Gadol onen can do the avodah. So the Torah was more makil in the case of an onen. Is eno dinsha hutreitz o Kohen hedjot bekorban tzibur. Chach, at least let's derive a heter for an onen in the case of a korban tzibur. And that was Rava's point, that an onen who does the avodah of a korban tzibur, it's kosher. Maskif la Rava bar Ailoi, a different Rava, and he doesn't like this Kal V'chomer. He says lo tutar aninus etzel kohen gadol bekorban yachid mikal v'chomer. You're assuming that was Rava's premise here, that the Kohen who's an onen could do his avoda even in the case of a korban yachid. How do you know such a thing? Ma tumah shehutra etzel kohen hedjod betzibur. Right, so we said that any Kohen whose Tomei could do the avoda of a korban tzibur, but lo hutreitzel Kohen gadol bekorban yachid. A Kohen gadol, if he's right, even a Kohen gadol, if he's Tomei, he can't do the avoda of a korban yachid. Aninus shelo hutra eitzel Kohen hedjed bekorban tzibur. Aninus doesn't have that kula that a Kohen hedjot, who's an onen, could do the avoda of a korban tzibur. Is eno din shelo tutar eitzel Kohen gadol bekorban yachid. The tusar tuva etzel Kohen gadol bekorban yachid mikal v'chomer. Right, let's derive from a kal v'chomer that a Kohen Gadol should be able to do the avoda of a korban tzibur. I'm sorry, that a Kohen Gadol, even if he's tameh, should be able to do the avoda of a korban yachid. Man, initial hutreitzel Kohen hedjot bekorban tzibur is hutreitzel Kohen Gadol bekorban yachid is tuma shehutreitzel Kohen hedjot bekorban tzibur. Right, tuma is less chamor because we have a heter in the case, even a regular coin of tzibur. And odinsha hutra eitzel Kohen Gadol bekorban. How much more so should be matir tuma in the case of a Kohen Gadol, even on a korban yachid. So when it says, well, tutar tuma eitzel Kohen hedjo bekorban tzibur mikal v'chomer. Right? In the case of a Kohen hedjot, we're not going to allow him to do the avod of a korban tzibur in tuma, and that we're going to derive from a kal v'chomer. Uma anina shehutra eitzel Kohen Gadol bekorban yachid. Right? We know that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to do the avoda even though he's an onen, and even in the case of a korban yachid. But nevertheless, lahutra eitzel Kohen hedjot bekorban tzibur. Right? A Kohen hedjot in Aninus cannot do the avoda even in the case of a korban tzibur. Is tuma shalo hutreitzel Kohen Gadol. We have to be more machmer in the case of tuma because a Kohen Gadol has no heter of doing avoda betuma even for a korban yachid. Ein odin shalo tutar b'kohen hedjo b'korban tzibur. Kal v'chomer that we should not be allowing a Kohen hedjot who is not mutter in a case of aninas to do the avoda even of a korban tzibur. We should certainly conclude that in tuma ein odin shelo tutar b'kohen hedjot b'korban tzibur. He says here, the kashrus of a korban tzibur offered b'tuma only applies to a case where the Kohen Gadol did the avodah, not to a Kohen hedjot who did the avodah b'tuma. All right, so this is where this will stop. I mean, the next line at the bottom of the Omud, which is in parentheses, that's what they call a mnemonic device to help us remember. So you know what? If you don't mind, let's just fit one more line in here on the top of Yud Zayin. Ella ikal and mifrach. So this is the final conclusion of Rava Bar Ilai. Hachi. The ikal mifrach hachi. Kol chada v'chada teku b'duchta. Right? You can learn a kal v'chomer this way. You can learn a kal v'chomer that way, and you'll end up with a conflict in what you derive, and therefore, kol chad v'chad teku b'duchta. Each one of these dinim that are derived from the Torah should serve as a component in the kal v'chomer and should remain in its place. In other words, the psukim that teach us that these dinim should be understood to apply categorically should not be modified by the means of a kal v'chomer. We basically exclude kal v'chomer. So when the Gemara says ikal mifrach hachi, ikal mifrach hachi, let's give an example. Rava Bar Ilai's first kal v'chomer accepts as a premise that a Kohen Gadol who is tameh is mechal the avoda of a korban yachid. At the same time, it teaches that a Kohen Gadol who is an onen would passel the avoda, machal the avoda of a korban yachid. The second Kal V'chomer of Rava, Bariloi, will give us the exact opposite conclusion, namely that a Kohen Gadol whose Tameh does not invalidate the avoda of a Karban Yachid, and accepts as a premise that a Kohen Gadol who is an Onein would not be Mechal the avoda of a Karban Yachid. Since we cannot know which Kal V'chomer to expound, which one to reject, therefore we reject both Kal V'chomers. We have to leave the psukim with their categorical, unmodified meanings. Thus, the pasuk which permits a Kohen Gadol to perform the avoda in the state of aninus is to be understood in absolute sense, referring to both a Karban Tzibur and a Karban Yachid. Likewise, the pasuk that pasels the avoda of a Kohen Hedjod, who is an Onein, will be understood to apply universally regarding both a Karban Yachid and even a Karban Tzibur. Similarly, when we derive from the psukim that a Karban Tzibur could be sacrificed b'tumah, which is called tumah hutch b'tzibur, that should apply to both a Kohen Gadol and an ordinary Kohen Hedjod. And finally, the psul of a Karban Yachid, when it was brought b'tumah, will pertain even if the Karban's avoda was performed by a Kohen Gadol. Okay, so we're up to Tful Yom here on the top of Yud Zayin. Mitzvah Shem, we'll pick that up tomorrow.